is if you go to open Adobe InDesign, your screen will probably look something like this. So go ahead and download that Swedish sashimi image, the one that doesn't have text. Again, you're going to download this one, the Swedish fish image. Download this image. We're going to be making this. Obviously, that's not a whole lot of changes. And then I'll explain what in the world we're doing with InDesign. So InDesign, I think I'm very experienced in Photoshop. I have limited experience in Illustrator, but I also have a lot of experience in Adobe InDesign. Miranda and Kayla and Abigail, for example, can tell you that Adobe InDesign is what we use to design every issue of your award-winning campus newspaper. It is almost a weekly thing for me to use InDesign as a part of my job. And one of the best things about InDesign is that it was created to go right along with Illustrator, to work right along with Photoshop, so that these programs can really just kind of jive together. And so before we talk about how in the world to maybe make a poster or an ad or a newspaper or a magazine in InDesign, I think it's important, just real quick, to tell you why it's primarily used. If Photoshop is primarily there to workshop and change photographs, Illustrator is there for logos and for drawing. InDesign is mostly there for you to make multiple page documents. Obviously, you're using it for a newspaper ad that is a one-page document, but for the most part, it's kind of crazy to think about, but every magazine that you've ever flipped through, pretty much any book that you've ever read probably happened on Adobe InDesign. Anything that's more than one page, the industry standard is Adobe InDesign for creating brochures, newspapers, magazines, books, and so on and so forth. So that's why we use InDesign, is for documents. Now, one thing that's kind of important is, unlike Illustrator or unlike Photoshop, all your documents are going to need home. And so what you want to do, what I highly recommend, can't recommend enough, is when you are working with InDesign on a project, I would encourage you to make a folder for that project, and then to put all the files you have for that project in that folder. It's sort of confusing, but you open an image in Photoshop, you're opening that image. What you're opening in InDesign is a preview of the image that exists elsewhere. So I would encourage you to have a folder where all the stuff you're working on for this ad is going to live in that folder, and that'll come in handy in just a minute. So it's not in every tutorial that you're finding, but I would actually start even before we start in InDesign. If you're working with InDesign, make a folder, put all the files that you're going to be working with in that folder. Okay, so we're going to make a new design document. And this is kind of the same awkward thing that we ran into with Photoshop, and especially with Illustrator, for those of you that were there that Monday, is the default setting on InDesign, if you're new to using it, is going to be picas. There's 12 points in a pica, 6 picas in an inch. Because y'all don't know that off the top of your head, let's not make that the default. So you want to change the units from picas or points to inches, And suddenly 8.5 by 11, you know what that is. That's a standard sheet of paper. A couple of other things that you'll see in a preset for InDesign. It's going to ask you how many pages. There's no reason to change this number. You can always add more pages later. So it's just good to start with one. Ask you what page do you want to start with. Again, if we were Macmillan books or we were Scholastic books or whatever, you know, we might start on page 3 because there's an artist that's designing page 1 and 2. But for us, for now, for most cases, we're going to start obviously with the first page. It's going to ask you how many columns you plan to have. Again, we can change this later, so leaving that as 1 is perfect. There's a couple other things that you will see. One of these is called facing pages. Facing pages, if you think about opening a book, opening a magazine, something like that, obviously those pages are facing one another. That makes sense. But for now, since we're only working with one single page, we're going to uncheck facing pages. And then there's 2 more things that we need to change. We have margins, we have bleed slug, and we have maybe different numbers on them than I have here. What I want y'all to do for this project and for also this activity we're doing right now is to change all those to 0. So I think my default was like 0.5 or something when I opened this earlier. I'm going to make all these 0. And what this has to do is really your printer. And typically, whether you're printing it locally or having it printing and shipped to you, typically the print shop will be able to tell you, you know, what should your bleed be, what should your margins be. So for now, for technical reasons, we're not going to worry about that. We're going to assume we have the best printer in the world who needs no room for bleeding over with ink. No extra margins for printing. We're going to assume they can print all the way precisely to the very corner of the page, even though they probably actually can't. So all that to 0. And then finally, this one is a question. We have a column gutter. Anyone know what that means when it talks about the gutter? We know what the gutter means in terms of graphic design. Obviously, the gutter, you know, is you don't want to end up in the gutter. But beyond that definition of gutter, anybody know what gutter means in graphic design? In addition to being the place that you don't want to end up, all the gutter is the actual space, the actual space between columns. So if you've read a textbook this week, your campus newspaper this week, a magazine article this week, and you've seen columns, the gutter is just the amount of white space in between the columns. So 0.167, which I think is 1/8 of an inch, is pretty standard for column size. So 0.1667, that's a 1/6 of an inch. So you've got that 8.5 by 11, 1 page, your unchecked facing pages, 1 for start, 1 for columns, 0 for everything else. Finally, you're going to hit create. Look at this. We made a nothing. So far, so good. You did great. So let's talk about turning this into a page of layout. So don't worry about what I'm doing right now. In theory, there are only about 4 things that you need to learn how to do in InDesign to be fairly proficient in InDesign. There are a bunch of tools here, as Abigail or Michaela or Andy might be able to tell you, that are tools. We design, for example, the campus newspaper every Wednesday night in GCR, And in InDesign, we use selection tool, we use the type tool, we use the frame tool, we might use the zoom tool, and we're going to play around with colors, obviously, but that's about it. So the gap tool, the content collector tool, the pen tool, the pencil tool, the scissors tool, the free transform tool, a lot of these you won't really be using often. So as we go, and we only talk about like 4 of these today, don't panic. I'm going to show you like the 4 things that I think are practically useful. So one thing that you'll be aware of is when you take your photo for a team or club or ministry or group that you want to promote for your back page ad that's due on Sunday, is the ad will probably take up almost all of your finished InDesign file. And so what you can do with InDesign, and please don't follow along right now, just watch what I'm doing, please don't follow along quite yet, is when you're working with InDesign, if we were designing a newspaper page, we might go through and say, okay, well, we're going to put our headline here, and then 2 photos here, kind of this oblong photo here, and our text here. And we can go through and actually do what's called dummying a page. Unfortunate abbreviation. It's really common if you have any aspirations to work for marketing, to work in magazines, to work in newspapers, to actually be able to tell what a page might like, even though there's no text or words on it. So these tools are kind of also there so that we can kind of figure out if we're doing a big photo and a small text box and a big text box. Do y'all see how that can kind of help you plan a page fairly quickly, fairly efficiently? It even gives you the option, if you want, if you control click on a Mac, right click on a PC, and fill with placeholder text. So now I can go through and say, oh, well, my page of layout might look like this. Thanks, Michaela. I'm glad you said yes. So let's talk about those 2 tools I was just using. Your main friend in InDesign is going to be this black arrow at the very top. This is the selection tool. I'm going to call it the black arrow because there's nothing about it that suggests that it's actually the selection tool. So I'm going to call it the black arrow. If we're using it the correct term, we're going to call it selection tool. And then about, I would say almost halfway down your toolbar is the rectangle frame tool. These 2 are really your best keys to success here in InDesign. So pretty simple, pretty straightforward. So let's say that we want to fill our entire page with a photograph. The way InDesign works is it's going to let you put a frame, and then just like you would frame, I don't know, a picture of your significant other that you love so very much, and you would put that in a frame and put it on your wall or put it on your desk or whatever. In the same way, you're going to put a frame on this canvas, and then you're going to fill it with an image. Something that I want to point out real quick is just like Photoshop and Illustrator, before I showed you how to use that frame tool, if I'm talking about something that you don't see here, so if I'm talking about the layers window and you don't see it, or I'm talking about the type character window and you don't see it, keep in mind this is just like Illustrator and Photoshop. Any window that you can't see, they're all here. But long story short, to put our rectangle in, you've got a couple options. You can actually go in, just select your rectangle frame tool, freehand it. This will put a frame up. What you could also do is click inside that frame if you want to be more precise and say, I want this to be an 8x10 frame. And it'll make a frame that's that size. If you're wondering if you freehanded it, what size is your frame? You can look over here and see the width and height over here in the transform window. Y'all still with me? Got about 10 minutes left. I'm going to try to make the most of it. Thanks, Phil. Thanks, more. Thanks, Mallory. I like this. So you'll see that my frame is real off center. There's no way that this would be a usable thing. I would obviously want my image to be on the page for the ad that I'm making. So to move that, there is no move tool in InDesign. Instead, you're going to use your selection tool or the black arrow to grab this frame and to move it wherever you want. Much like Illustrator, this will also have guides that show up. You see how it's kind of showing up pink on my design. This is letting me know, hey, am I at the center of this image or not? So use those kind of guides to help you. And look, I've made a frame. How exciting. Now, obviously, what we got to do is something in frame. To do that, we're going to go to File, and we're actually going to choose Place. So if you remember when I talked about how making that photo is going to be key, or that folder, I should say, is the key to success in InDesign. Now you got to go find where that folder is, and you're just going to put stuff in there. So you're going to go to File and choose Place, and then I'm going to put my image, which I put in the Fish Project folder, there, and I'm going to place it right there. Boom. So if you're playing along and you're wanting to finish the assignment number 19 as a homework assignment, we finished step 5 of 9. We're almost done here, believe it or not. So we placed our image. Now, depending on the size of frame that you have drawn and the resolution and size of the image that you put in, it might be too big, it might be too small. If you use what's called the white arrow, or more precisely called the direct selection tool, you can actually go in and change what part of this image is going to be inside the frame. So this blue box is your actual frame, and this orange box is going to let you choose what's going inside that frame. So you can see that my image is just about the same height, but you see how it's much wider? So I can go in and I can choose what part I want to show. Again, you could actually, make the image bigger, make it wider. You can do all sorts of weird, stupid stuff with it if you wanted to. You're going to use your white arrow to kind of choose what you want to fill the frame with. Then you go back to your selection tool or the black arrow, click off the canvas, and it'll show you what it looks like there nice after you've moved the image. Still here? Still with me? Everybody able to follow along that can? Lots of good yeses. I like it. I like it. Okay, cool. This is this is maybe the worst part of teaching this tutorial is online. Is if I was teaching this in person, I could look at your screens or look at your eyes and say, oh man, she looks bored. He looks like he's confused. Whatever. I'm just trying to make sure you guys are following along as best you can. Okay, so again, if you can place an image in InDesign, you're good as gold. That's two of the most likely things you're going to be doing with InDesign. What that means is any editing that you need to do to that image, other than resizing it. So if you're changing the brightness, the contrast, you're adding any effects to it, you're photoshopping something out, you need to do all that work on that file in Photoshop. Then when you're done with that individual photograph, done with that individual image, then and only then would you place it in InDesign. But that's how easy it is to ultimately place a finished image in here. Two things we want to do is we want to talk about how to add text. You guessed it, you will do that with the type tool. So our little textbook tutorial tells us to type Swedish sashimi. One thing you'll notice is if you just click and start typing, InDesign isn't going to get along with you very much. InDesign really wants you to draw a box for the text. So we can always resize and move that box later. Don't worry if it's too big, too small, too wide, whatever. Just draw a box. And you will see that unlike, at least on my version, my options bar is on the right. Your options bar for the text tool might be up at the top, depending on what version of InDesign you're using. Either way, this is just like Word or Photoshop or anything else that we've used. So I'm going to choose a font that everyone has on their computer, even though it's not correct for the example. I'm going to choose the most boring one ever, which is Times New Roman. It's not boring, it's very efficient. I'm going to type Swedish sashimi. Sashimi is just kind of a sushi-like kind of dish, by the way. I'm going to type that in. If you need to change that text, all you have to do is highlight it, and you can go in and you can change what size that is. Again, if you don't like the options from the drop-down menu, you can go ahead. For example, your homework assignment says to make this 20-point font, so you can actually type that in. Then you can go in, resize your text box, and we're going to put this kind of close to the top of your image. And we can click off of that to kind of see what it will look like. Two things I want to show you real quick is how in the world do we change the color of this? Well, if we highlight our text, we can actually color match our text to something within the photograph, which is not required for your last project, but is a pretty cool thing. Now, what you need to do for that is you need to choose the eyedropper tool. InDesign in 2020, in 2019, and I think in 2018's version as well, defaults to the color theme tool. But just like Photoshop, just like Illustrator, InDesign hides certain tools under others. So if you click the color theme tool and try to do what I'm doing right now, it won't work. I'll say that again because someone's going to try to do it and get frustrated. If you click the color theme tool, what I'm about to show you won't work. You need to select the eyedropper tool. Then if your text is selected, sorry, if your text is selected, that's easy for me to say, you can actually go into your image and you can select, let's say, the red of the Swedish fish, the green of the plate, the wood grain of the background. I'm getting so tongue-tied. Y'all can make fun of me later. Or we can select kind of the white of the rice, which is what the tutorial for next week's assignment suggests. So we can use this eyedropper tool, click on the white of the rice. Then again, if we use our black selection tool, click off of it. Guess I didn't click on the white of the rice. There we go. So then we have, again, an off-white. that kind of matches some of the rice down there as our Swedish sashimi. You could, of course, go ahead and highlight your text. Go over here to our color option and choose any color that you wanted from the color picker as well. I just think that eyedropper tool is pretty cool. And now if we go to view and we choose screen mode presentation, this will show us what the ad would look like without any kind of grids or in this case blue text boxes, blue frame boxes. So we can go to screen mode. Instead of normal, we can choose presentation. And this will show us, again, without any text boxes or anything, how nice this looks. And again, this is a ridiculous example. No one's turning Swedish fish into sushi, I hope. I like both of them individually, not together. But you can see how nice this looks. And all we did is we took a photograph and we added some text to it. So I've got 12 o'clock on my watch. What the assignment that's due next Tuesday that uses the Swedish fish graphic will ask you to do is to add one more kind of block of text at the bottom left. Which we can do real quick for the sake of time. Again, we can use our eyedropper tool to match even the text that we used beforehand. We can change our font size here. We highlight it, change the font size, click off of that screen, and we go to View, Screen Mode, Presentation, and look, that's all your InDesign assignment for next week even is. If you can add text, you can change the color of that text, change the size and typography of that, and edit some really cool photos. InDesign can be a very simple and very useful program. To save it, just so I show you one last thing, I'm going to save as an InDesign file. So in this case, I'm going to save it as fishy because I don't know what to save it as. And then let's say we were done with it, we would go to export and we could export it as JPEG, as sorts of things. We're going to export it, let's say, as a PDF. And so it's that simple. As we kind of come to a close for today, I want to just thank y'all for playing along.